Welcome to the show No Instructions, where we meet with founders and interview them about starting and growing their businesses. I'm your host, Chad Ingram, three-time founder and CEO at Distro. Distro is a platform to help businesses build teams by breaking down borders around the world. Let's go ahead and get started with today's guest and see how they built their business. Thank you for coming on to the show, No Instructions. Today we have the founder and chairman of eVisit today, Bret Larsen. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Chad.
Yeah.
Awesome to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you on the show, and thanks for taking the time. We know you're busy, and you've had a lot of changes in the business in the last year or so. So we're going to go ahead and get started and jump right in and learn a little bit about your journey. And so the first question that I have for you is, what was the problem that you were trying to solve with eVisit, and when was that?
It's a good question. I think, the vision mission evolved like as we dove in, but the genesis of starting the company initially was trying to solve the business model of a company I was working at. So my background educationally is in accounting and marketing. I got dual major from Arizona State University. And during my undergrad, I started and sold a small e-commerce company, came out of it just like during my senior year at ASU, sold it.
This was a business that you started in college?
Correct. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I knew I wanted to do it again. And as I evaluated the things I loved about the e-commerce side, really it came down to like the growth aspect. Like, how do you architect business processes and lead gen channels to drive growth? It's exciting to see people buy something or exchange monetary value for something you've put into the world.
Right.
And so knowing I want to do it again, there were like two elements at the time that I was trying to optimize for. One was margin. So physical goods typically have a lower margin, which means that we didn't have as much free cash flow to play with as I would have liked to test and hire and do those kind of things. And the second was, I actually can't remember what the second was, but that was enough that I narrowed the opportunity down to software, right?
Right.
It was supply chain. It was like sourcing and fulfilling products took time. The minute you bought the product, the value of that, of your inventory started to decrease. And so I started looking at it. I was like, well, this was 2012-ish, 2011, 2012. And so software as a service was a thing, but it wasn't like, it was a thing. It wasn't like the thing.
It was new at the time. Yeah. I mean, things were moving to the cloud at that point.
Yeah. I mean, in Phoenix, there were a couple of companies that had attached the model and were doing really good. Infusionsoft, now known as Keep,
right.
WebPT. So anyway, I went to, there were two industries I said I'd never work in coming out of my undergrad. I was interviewing with all these different companies that recruited out of ASU, Ford and Dell and Target, like all these companies. From a marketing track perspective, I realized that if I had gone into accounting, I'd be, no offense to the accountants listening, but I'd be clinically depressed. And I realized like the two industries I'd never wanted to work in were education and healthcare. And so of course I took an opportunity with a startup in Scottsdale called Stat Doctors, in healthcare.
In healthcare.
And the whole model of Stat Doctors was, it was the Teladoc model, right? Like they were selling to large self-funded employers, and with the whole idea that, the average cost to get to the ER is $1,500, and their self-funded employers are paying exorbitant, like more than they need to.
And this was your first job out of college.
Well, yeah. So I sold the e-commerce business, and I knew I wanted to do it again, but I also knew there was a lot I didn't know.
Sure.
And I wanted to experience, something. And this startup came on my radar from one of my instructors at ASU. And so I took the position. I was their employee number 6 as their marketing manager.
Okay.
And I was there about 18 months. And my whole job was to make employees of the employer who purchased the offering, having a doctor available 24/7, 365, right, via video or telephone to diagnose and treat issues. So employers could keep employees out of the urgent care and emergency room,
right,
which is where 67% of of us go when we have an issue because we don't really have a relationship with primary care doctor.
Correct.
And so my whole job was to drive awareness with these employees and drive them to become patients, register their accounts and become patients. Like the one metric that mattered that I had at the top of my notepad
Right.
was how many new patients had registered that day, right? Like that's what I kept track of every single day. And I was there about 18 months. And
what year was this?
This was 2000. I started there in 2012. I left in 2000. I must have started in 2011 and left in 2013
13 or 14. Yeah.
13. And I was watching our growth. Like this is a hard sell back then. And I was watching our growth, and we went from like, I won't give specific numbers,
Sure.
but the business was eventually acquired by Teladoc, and they did great. But over those 18 months, we grew by like $7,000 or $8,000 in monthly membership revenue. So they were charging $1 per employee per month to have access to the service, and then a one-time visit fee would care. And that like, it didn't seem like how innovative the product was, and our growth trajectory didn't seem to overlap. Like there was something missing for me. And I started noodling on it and trying to figure it out. And at the time, we would compare what we were doing at Stat Doctors. We were Uberizing healthcare, which at the time, every company was Uberizing some market.
Something. Yeah.
So investors love to hear that, right? It's like AI, ML today, right? Like, oh, we're AI for whatever. It was like, and then we would in the pitches, we compare ourselves to online banking and the adoption curve that happened. And as I looked at those two models, at the time, like Uber's black car service had just started to get a lot of traction from a word of mouth perspective. And as I looked at it, there's a lot of noise from the taxi cab industry with municipalities and other areas where they were talking about like trying to block Uber from picking up from the airports, or like they were aware of the threat.
Yeah.
And the question I had is, if we're the Uber of healthcare, who are we disrupting? And it was hospitals and doctors' offices, right? Whose patients would normally go to see them, but might come to us instead. And where would the taxi cab industry be today if they had provided better access, more convenient access to their services? And my thought was they wouldn't be where they're at, right? Because Uber essentially came in. They also undercut them from a price perspective, offered an elevated experience, but it was the ease of access, and you felt
right. You didn't need to go hail a cab.
Yeah, you felt cool hailing a black car from your phone, and like the guy coming and picking you up felt like cool stuff.
Yeah.
So I took that analogy, I took it back to healthcare, and I was like, what's the analog? And it occurred to me it was hospitals and health systems.
So at this time, Bret, were you still maybe towards your tail end of working at the company as you're seeing this problem, at the first startup? Or
I was actually I was trying to solve it for the company, right? Like I went to the executive team with this insight, and I was like, hey, here's the growth story. Like, take a look at the growth. Let's pivot. Let's not be the service side of it. Let's be the platform that enables existing service providers to distribute their services more fully. Like, it was a pitch to be like, let's become Shopify meets Zoom for healthcare, right? We can help these groups e-commerceify their business. And because the other big barrier is I ended up doing quite a bit of product work as a marketing manager, because I'd go out to employee health fairs and pitch people on this.
Yeah.
And the feedback I'd pitch them on it, like, you can have a doctor 24/7, 365, anywhere you need it, board certified. And they'd be like, you can't do that. They'd be like, no, we can. 99% satisfaction ratings. We definitively treat 97% of every patient we see. Like, I was pitching them, and they're like, no, you can't do that. I was like, well, why not? I'm like, the doctor can't touch me. They can't take my temperature. They can't check my blood pressure. You can't do this. And after 3 or 4 health fairs like that, I started asking the employees, I'm like, what if this was your doctor? Would you use it then? And they'd pause and they'd be like, my doctor? I was like, yeah, you've been in her office. She's looked up your nose and in your ears and down your throat. Like, you have a relationship with this person. Would you use it? And they were like, yeah, heck yeah, I would. And so on the consumer side, I was like, they would use it. And then I did a lot of like in-clinic interviews with physicians to see if they would use it.
How So as you're giving this feedback to, the company you're working for, like, how did they receive that?
They were always really receptive, but it was clear when I told them we should pivot. The response was, Bret, interesting feedback, very, very interesting insights. We're not going to do that. Stay focused. We need to stay focused, which is super important, right? Like you have some 20-some-year-old kid coming and trying
these
to
crazy ideas.
Business, right? Yeah. And so I think after they gave me feedback, hey, we're not doing that. Like, stay focused. And then, by the way, I still have a great relationship with all of these individuals, like amazing people. The founder's actually starting a new business around health equity.
Oh, very cool.
I'm gonna invest. He's amazing. He's
awesome.
Great guy. And I always knew they were going to be successful too. Like, just because of the grit and determination this guy had, like he just would not relent. He's awesome. So it was about 2 weeks after that I was like, if you're not going to do this, I am. Like, I can't let this go. Like, I think there's a big opportunity here. And they were like, well, good luck. Just a reminder, you have a non-compete in place. It lasts a year. And so I was like, that's fine. In my mind, I'm like, it's going to take a year to get this stuff pulled together. Anyway,
right.
So in the meantime, I took a position with a very a boutique venture firm that had like a accelerator program on the side, and I worked as their director of marketing and strategy, and I helped like 89 of their portfolio companies / accelerator participants strategically position themselves in their categories as categories of one, test that messaging in their go-to-market motions,
right,
and iterate on how to like really resonate with
almost like like an incubator. And
yeah,
did you so you leave your job, you say, look, there's a big opportunity here. It's going to take a year. Do you feel like it was like a half-hearted, maybe I'll try this out at some point? Or do you feel like, no, there really could be something here. Why don't I start preparations?
It was more, there really is something here. I had like every intention of doing it. Right. And so, I also saw, I had 2 opportunities leaving Stat Doctors. One paid more. The other one was Tall Wave.
Yeah.
And I took the Tall Wave because I realized I would be able to see a lot more of these businesses and pick up on context and really learn things and test the things I was trying to test on these different businesses and accelerate the feedback loop. So I knew I was going to do it. This was summer of 2013, end of June. I incorporated the LLC, I think July.
And what was it called? What was it called back then?
It was eVisit.
Is always eVisit.
There was a gentleman that worked for the company as their chief medical officer. He had the domain name. He offered it to them. They didn't want it. I approached him and I was like, hey, let's do this. And so I recruited him on, and we ended up buying the patent, or not the patent, but the trademark for the eVisit Inc. or eVisit, the mark, from a company in California that wasn't using it, like $5,000 or something like that. And
at the time, what did your family look like? I know you have children now. You're married. What was your family like at the time?
So, gosh, I was probably 27. We had our first.
Okay.
I think, I don't remember if my wife was pregnant with our second yet. I don't think she was. But when I left Tall Wave, I don't think she was. So we had one who was almost 2.
So if you had, you've got this idea and you're pretty convinced it's going to work. You leave and you go to this other group, and you've got your day job. You're probably moonlighting a little bit, getting things prepared, starting. Like, at some point, you're going to leave altogether and worry about taking home your own paycheck. Like, what were those conversations like with your spouse? Rather than just taking an easy paycheck. The lot less risk there. Well,
so if you fast forward, I'll get to that, because it's a key piece of the story. It is a key piece of the story. Like, I think my true co-founder was my wife.
Yeah.
So I was at Tall Wave for about a year. I got recruited to a company called Campus Logic about 12 months later as their VP of marketing, to help Greg Scoresby is an amazing CEO. He exited Campus Logic a year or two ago and
Yeah.
started a capital fund here in Phoenix Capital,
Awesome.
Phoenix Ventures. Awesome guy. If you're looking to raise capital, reach out to Greg.
Everyone listen.
Yeah. He is honestly, like, I would back Greg in anything he does. He's just he's just good people, measured, awesome. So anyway, and I'll share with you why I feel that way.
Yeah.
I was at Campus Logic 6 months, helped them transition from a service-based business to a SaaS model. They built some technology to help with the financial aid verification process. So I broke my second rule, which was no education. I was like, no healthcare, no education. That's what I did. And about 6 months into my tenure at Campus Logic, I had borrowed $50,000 on a note from some family to build out the MVP for eVisit, right? To get it to a place where there was like an initial product. Somewhere around here, I still have the notebooks where I hand drew the wireframes for the interface and like the early logo drawings and all that
So
stuff.
you're combing over a period of time here. Now, granted, in the amount of time we have on this episode, there's only so much time that we could go over, but you're talking about a year and a half to where you're really thinking this out, buying the assets needed to, publish this business and register this business. And, seems like kind of later you start actually getting into what can the app look like.
I can't remember the order I did it in.
Sure.
But it definitely was all turned around. Like, I think I got the logo first, and arguably the least important part of anything you're building. Like, sure, you need brand guidelines
but he needed a hat. He had to make his hats.
Yes. People need to know you're at least thinking about something.
Yeah.
But I found an engineer on TopTal, and I didn't have money to pay TopTal's rates. So I found the engineer and I went and looked for him up on LinkedIn. I reached out to a bunch directly. And I found a guy who was traveling South America with his dog, expat. Hired him to build.
He was an American.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Ends up, 50 grand wasn't enough to get the MVP launched. My
Turns
partner,
out.
and yeah. If only. I actually think it probably is, and I just don't think I did it right.
For sure.
I think it probably is. My partner put in a little bit more money. I put, I think, 30 grand on a credit card. So and during college, before I started that business, I was a teller at Bank of America, and I got one of their employee credit cards that had like a 4% interest rate.
Right.
So I put 30 grand on a credit card, which I don't recommend this part. Like, I didn't tell my wife that, right? I'm like, that's whatever. We'll pay it off when this is $1 billion company. So I borrowed some money from family. Like, come October of 2014.
How much money do you think you have at this point? Credit cards, cash? Yeah. Or do you have that you've gathered and that you have ready to use?
100, and that we spent it as we went along.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably collectively like 100 grand, 120, somewhere between there.
Okay.
And in the meantime, I had thrown up a landing page. Had started posting blog posts and driving traffic, and getting signups. And that was the metric I used early on when we started pitching people for capital. Was, hey, we have these many people signed up for access to the product when we launch.
Right.
And we'd done a bunch of like directory listings for startups and trying to get people, interested and aware. And it come October, like, we started getting phone calls, like, to learn more about the product. Like, inbound leads started coming in. And I was pretty strict about not spending.
Where would that really come from, though? That early on.
Organic traffic, right? Like, we had a content strategy on the front end before we launched the product at all. So we were working on building thought leadership. Like, my background's in marketing, it's in digital marketing, growth marketing. Right. So I was working on focused on building thought leadership around telemedicine, telehealth, virtual care for the physician to give to their patients. And so we started getting some organic traffic, and there were like startup directories we'd listed on that I'm sure, sent out email blasts, our logo on them. We started getting phone calls, or some of the early ones. There were some from Europe, like, there enough that it felt real. And I
So
didn't have, go ahead.
just clarifying question and coming back to your team. So you've got this expat that you've found who's traveling around maybe South America, and you've hired him, and he's running the code side of things, and you have a co-founder. I mean, what does the team look like at this point?
So I had a designer,
Okay.
and none of these were full-time. They were all contractors. I had a designer. I had this expat. He had found a front end or a back end engineer, because I kept going, hey, we need to go faster. How do we make this faster? He found a front end or back end engineer. I think it was front end in Eastern Europe, I think,
Okay.
or Portugal. And then around that time, it just wasn't moving fast enough. And so I threw my
Says
threw my
every
brother-
CEO and founder.
Yeah, always right. It's still not moving fast enough. My brother-in-law had worked for a guy named Miles Romney,
Okay.
who had exited a business and started a boutique like engineering consulting firm. So I reached out to Miles and hired him to finish out the product at his company Spork Labs. And then it was around October that like I sat down with the initial co-founder. Miles ended up becoming a co-founder like immediately. Well, I'll tell you the story, but
Right.
we sat down with my partner, and he's in a different situation, right? ER physician, he makes a great living. In moving to Campus Logic, I was now making more money than I'd ever made from a salary perspective. We had benefits. We had
Right.
some excess capital to like be comfortable with.
So
So I went to my
everyone
wife.
is contracting, moonlighting, including you.
Yeah. Yeah. Mine's nights and weekends. Like I was
Right.
very, I learned early on that like I didn't feel good about spending my employer's time working on my stuff. I just
Yeah.
like didn't think it was honest. And so I went to my wife and I was like, hey, I think I went to my co-founder and we talked, and he was like, look, I'll cover your salary for the first 6 months. Right. I'll cover for the first 6 months. And if it's not something real, but at that point, then like we'll figure out what we need to do for you to find the next gig. So he provided like a nice glide path. But then I went to my wife and I was like, Bree, I think this is real. And I think unless we put full focus on it, I don't think it's like I need to know if it's real, like, and without focusing on it 100%, but I need for you to be on board. And she was like, this is a little more personal. She's like, let me pray about it. Right.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. So she came back, I can't remember, it was a couple weeks later. I don't know. And she was like, all right. She's 9 months pregnant with our second baby at this time. Right. So like,
Bad timing, Bret.
yeah. Yeah. I try to really, when I go, I go all in. And she's like, I'm in, I can support this. And she's pretty risk averse. Like
Okay.
she would have been happy if I had been an accountant. And she's like, I'm in, but let me buy Christmas for the kids or the kid first. I was like, okay. So she buys Christmas. I go in and I tell Greg, mind you, I've been there 6 months, right? Like I kind of mentioned to him that I was working on something when he hired me, but I don't know. Frankly, I don't know. I didn't know that it was going to be
Sure.
this quick. And I fully expected him to just tear me apart, right? Like I even then knew how hard it was to find people to grow a startup, to drive growth, to get like the team together. And I was like, hey, I told him, he was like, you're kidding me. And I was like, no. He paused and he was like, you're going to do great. And then he opened his Rolodex. He had, this is 2004. He had a physical Rolodex.
Like a real Rolodex.
Yeah, as he flipped through it and he gave me 2 introductions to Capital, ended up giving us free office space in their loft for like a year. Like the guy was just like, and I've remained close with him since. He's just always been a huge support and very, very measured, right? Like that taught me an important lesson of how to treat people. Like he had every excuse and every reason to be very frustrated with me about leaving him high and dry, basically. So fast forward, Miles and I, we applied to a bunch of accelerators. Miles, we started pitching, and I learned all these things about Miles. Like he had built and sold the first mobile-based DHR to Blue Cross. This is before he had decided to come on full time. Built the first mobile-based DHR and sold it Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina. He had built and sold like a HIPAA compliancy suite to Zion.
This was the doctor co-founder?
No, this is the guy who ends up
Oh, the
becoming
new
our
one.
CTO.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Okay.
And so I started learning all these things. And I'm like, wow. So it wasn't more than a few weeks that we approached him. Was like, hey, do you want to? Because he was acting as like interim CIO. Because the early feedback we got from pitching was, you don't have a technical co-founder, you're not fundable. Like, I think that's maybe changed a little bit, or maybe it's different for a second, like someone second time around.
I think it's changed a little bit. I didn't have a technical co-founder in my last startup, and it was challenging for me.
Yeah,
And
it is
it's a
hard.
big advantage.
Yeah, it's hard because you don't know what you don't know. Like conceptually, you can understand certain things, but like the reality of actually digging in and figuring it out it's kind of black boxy.
Right.
So we approached Miles and we're like, hey, would you be interested in joining? And he was like, yeah, he named his terms. And we're like, okay, let's do it. So him and I went full-time in January 1 officially. Like I'd started December 1st for all intents and purposes, made our first hire by the 14th of December. This is 2014. First hire was a content marketing manager, first official hire, like W-2.
Do you feel like you're, I mean, I think it's interesting some of these first hires that startups make. And, why did you make that hire? Do you feel like you were swayed, more particularly, due to your marketing background? You see a lot of like CTO engineering led founders that, it seems like they only hire engineers. How did that feel like for you? Why did you prioritize that person?
I feel like we had the engineering side covered with Miles and the contractors from Spork Labs that we were paying.
Yeah.
So that wasn't as big of a concern. Like top of my mind was marketing and product. And I don't know why, because it didn't really matter at that point, but customer success, right? Like those were the three things that I was like, we got to get these things there. And so this woman is like the most amazing. She had just graduated with her degree in journalism from I can't remember where from, but I found her on Angel List. She took the job. She was living in the Bay Area, and I found out later that like what we were paying her wasn't enough to even cover rent, like
Wow,
monthly rent. Like it was like, I mean, no one was making a lot of money, but she was a rock star. Like I would hire her again anywhere in a second. Totally scrappy, absolutely the kind of person like pick up on a concept, create systems around it. So did that. Then we hired a product manager. Then we hired a customer success person. We hired a few salespeople. Along the way, I started raising capital with my physician co-founder through his network.
That was my next question, is how you're paying for all these people, right? So do you have, from the moment you went full time, did you have any sales yet?
No, we were nearing, like our first sale came in July of 2015. And
so you were still very focused on product and marketing at that point.
Yeah. And so we raised, like, I think my parents invested 25 grand, this guy's brother put money in. So we started working that over the course of from 2014 to 2016, when we closed our seed round, we raised, I think, $2 million from 53 different people. It was like, so you think about how much that, like how many no's we got along the way. Like, let's say 1 out of every 10. So we talked to 2,000 maybe. Like, I don't know what our hit rate was, but a lot of physicians invested, friends, a lot of friends, friends and family, former like entrepreneurs.
And for many people listening, I would say that's less common to have that many people on the cap table that early on, especially. But there is no one way to do anything, right?
No, I mean, the reality is, like, I say this, but like, I really want to do it again. So I don't know what's wrong with me. Like, if you knew how much it was going to take,
your brain is broken.
You wouldn't do it. My brain is broken. Like, I think there's something wrong with most founder entrepreneurs, but like, if you knew how much it was going to take, you'd probably be like, no, I'm not. Yeah, I'm good.
So I literally used to say that all the time while I was in my last startup jump. And I would say, now knowing what I know now, I don't think I could do it again. And then, we exit the business year later. I'm like, man, I'm really bored.
Yeah, I think that's what happens.
Yeah.
Right. Or your spouse is like, hey, you need to get a hobby or something.
Yeah.
Right? And then the hobbies, like you do the hobbies long enough, that like you feel not even mastery, but like some level of like, oh, I understand this, and then it's not interesting anymore.
Right. So, okay. So back to it. You raise a tiny little bit of money early on. You go full time. People are believing in you. You're getting good feedback, I'd imagine, from physicians and other potential users or patients, right? And you start hiring and you start raising a little bit of money along the way. Did you feel like you were like constantly raising if you were talking to that many people?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was always, I mean, it was, I mean, sure, if I looked hard enough, I could find all the people we spoke with. Like I could go back and like pull it together with my calendar stuff, but
Right.
it was a daily activity. You were always raising.
Now, as you're doing that, it takes a lot of time to fundraise. It really does. The prep work, the post work on, wrapping up after every call, the follow up, the due diligence items, like all these things, even for small checks, it takes a lot of time. Who was running the business with you at the time then? I mean, was there somebody you trusted, or were you really kind of doing it all at that point?
I mean, the whole team, right? Like we were all located. There were, by the time we moved out of that space, I think there were 13 or 14 of us in 653 square feet.
Wow.
In Greg's loft. But honestly, I had a great team, like pretty self-sufficient. And the thing is, like, we were all in such close quarter. This is one of the things that I really struggle with right now is like this remote work thing. I
Yeah.
love the idea of it, but in actuality, for an early stage startup, so much of what happens gets passed just through osmosis, right? Being in the same space as the other people, and you can
Right.
accelerate faster because you don't need to sit down and have a Zoom call about these things that are happening. You just heard it happen because someone was on a call with the customer or the engineering team. The site went down, and now you don't need to wait for Slack to pop off. Like
Right.
there's a lot of good things that happen naturally that way. So
Yeah.
I'd say, I mean, I was still operating the business. My physician co-founder was focused heavily on helping to create connections for capital raise through his network. Um, and so I'd end up coming in and selling them and on like the core business and like the message and the statistics. But he did a lot of the upfront work and warming them up and getting them to a place where they were interested. And then I was focused on sales, marketing, feedback
Everything.
Yeah,
Literally everything.
everything.
That's an exciting time. Let's fast forward just for a little context. Where's the business today? And we'll go back to the early stages. But where's the business? Headcount wise, and how much money have you raised? Revenue, if you're comfortable sharing.
So I won't share revenue. Our headcount's right around 85, down from where we were. I think height of the pandemic, we were like at 150.
Wow.
We raised a little over $78 million in total. So our seed round with Kickstart Seed Fund, our A round with TVC Capital, and then Goldman Sachs led our B round in the summer of June of 2021. I will share, like, our customers
Sure.
include some of the largest health systems in the country. So part of that journey is we in the early days, we'd sell anyone who had a credit card at $99 a month.
Yeah.
And we pivoted upstream. Today, we sell to enterprise hospitals and health systems. And there was a point in the journey where we brought on a CFO. He did a cohort analysis, realized that, massive churn with smaller customers. We started making changes. There was co-founder drama in there that created a lot of turmoil and I think, personal angst. Weathered through all that. I mean, into 2019, I had a board member who I'm very close with, and he did this as lovingly, I think, as anyone can. He's like, we closed an extension on our seed round, and he was like, Bret, there's no more money. He's like, all the reserves are deployed. He's like, 2020, you got to get profitable. You got to sell the business, or you're out of business, right? Like,
What'd you think?
And so, say what?
What was your reaction? How did that make you feel?
I was like, all right, it's time to get to work. I'd stopped taking a paycheck at that time. So, 6 months in, the business could support a meager salary for me.
So going back, so 2014, 2015, you guys are starting to gain some early traction, but selling more to small businesses. And fast forward to 2020, 4, 5, 6 years later, what does the big business look like at that point?
So if you look at so we went from 0 to 1 million in 13 months, and then we went from 1 million to 2 million in ARR in the next 10 months. So about 24 months, 0 to 2 million in ARR. And that's when we started looking at the churn and realizing, like, overnight, we changed minimum pricing to $500 a month. We put a mandatory implementation fee in place. They had to go through onboarding. At the time, the end of 2016, our average revenue per account was like $4,600 a year.
Yeah.
By the end of 2019, average revenue per account was $53,000 a year. So
Wow.
we did a massive shift, saw a lot of churn in the SMB, like single provider practices,
Right.
and pushed into like smaller enterprise deals with health systems and more mid-market stuff.
So as you're dealing with that early churn, you're just learning that in the first couple of years you've raised. When was your first institutional raise?
End of 2016 is when we closed the round of Kickstart.
So what did your investors say? I mean, did you feel frustrated, with the expectations? Did you feel like surprised maybe by what the churn could be looking like with the SMB customers?
Not totally. Like our
Sure.
CFO came from Infusionsoft, and they're an SMB. They served SMBs, right? And so
Right.
it was on my radar, and I had been working with SaaS businesses. It was on my radar that churn was going to be an issue, and I always tried to keep an eye on product utilization as an indication of like latent churn.
Right.
Honestly, I early the decision of who to take capital from. Sometimes it's not a decision. You just got to take money where you can find
It's
it.
true.
But the Kickstart team, Kickstart Seed Fund, based out of Salt Lake, like so measured, so even like, I think they saw me beating myself up. Like, how do we solve this? Like, they saw that I was in it, but like, I felt support. I never felt like my investors were beating me up about it.
Yeah.
They were really supportive. They brought data from other portfolio companies. They came to the table. It was the evolution of the business, and I don't
Yeah.
think these like investments never go the way anyone plans, right? I think this was a rockier one for
Yeah.
them, like more so because of some of the interpersonal things that happened with relationships in the business than the business itself. But like it was pretty rocky there for the early years.
It seems like they're happy now.
I think so.
Yeah, I think they're happy. Anybody listening could do some quick Googling on eVisit, and they'd be very satisfied to learn that you guys have done very well.
I think they're pretty happy. So
Yeah.
and that's for me, it's very personal to people who like, because in the early days you bet on the founder, right? Like,
Yeah.
who knows how many pivots you have to go through? Like, is the person at the helm going to like lean in, or are they going to be like, this seems like a lot of work?
Well, let's talk about that like slight pivot. And I don't even know if I would call that a pivot, but going from, all right, we're discovering who is our right customer, and we're discovering, more importantly, maybe who isn't our customer. And so the first thing you do is raise prices. Were you nervous about that?
No, our CFO had done such a good job at presenting the data. Like, we had empirical evidence, and he knew the playbook because it was something I think they dealt with at Infusionsoft.
Right.
So, the data came out, and it was very clear, if our customers who are spending less than $500 a month with us were 5 times more likely to churn. And again, our average ACV was 4,600. So this is the vast majority of our customers. We were on month-to-month contracts, right? And so all these things logically like made sense, or was like, okay, if the data is telling us that it's more likely to stick if they're paying us more money, we'll still give them the same amount of value or more. Like, you have to spend 500, but you can have this many seats for that $500.
Right.
And and by the way, like, it's a year contract. And also like there's an implementation fee now, which we always had one, but it was more like a gimmick to be like, oh, we can waive that if you sign up
Now,
today.
now, Brett, your logical brain knows that having gone through this, you know that this was that this worked out and why, like specifically, especially, looking at it over this period of time. But putting yourself in the moment, was there, and maybe there wasn't, but was there any angst about the idea of turning away sales? Because in raising prices, we're going to turn some customers away.
I'm sure there was, right? Like, but the data was so clear. Like it was so clear
Yeah.
long term, it wasn't going to be sustainable if we kept going the way we were going.
Yeah.
But I'm sure, I mean, like the idea of turning away from SMB entirely was frustrating because I was like,
Yeah.
no, maybe we can just like, let's automate the purchasing and onboarding process. And like, we can still keep selling to these guys. At the end of the day, our product was far too robust for a single provider group, right? Like they need
Right.
something more like Zoom. Um, so it was, I'm sure there was, but on that decision specifically, it was, data was just so clear. And I'd say that was, trying to think back, I don't think we had a lot of situations where we had like very, very clear things pointing like, this is what you need to do.
Yeah.
Because data can be kind of a rat's nest.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, it's good that you had the insight and the support both from your board and one of your CFO who had the insight and foresight to say, "Hey, this is a problem. Let's look at this." So, did that change much of your customer acquisition strategy?
Maybe it should have, but we had built a really strong inbound engine.
Yeah.
Um, and, I think it wasn't until late 2019, we made another pivot, like another ICP pivot to be like, hey, we're going to move further upstream. Like,
Yeah.
and so that's when our strategy, our like acquisition strategy probably really took more of a bigger shift.
Yeah. And how much time did that take from when you say, let's raise to that initial 500 a month from, 100 a month? And how long did you do that until you really went really upstream to sell these much larger customers people would know the names of?
Yeah, I think it was about a year later we looked at the cohort analysis again. We found that retention improved dramatically, right? Like but you still saw a drop off at month 13. Like so retention was way, way better, but then you'd see another drop off. Not as bad as it was, but it was still wasn't best in class. Like it wasn't a
Yeah.
like a key performance. It was a key performance indicator, but not one that we could like market as we went to raise capital. And so, I mean, to give you an idea, I think when we first did it, our retention, our worst month was like, we had like a 4% churn, which you annualize that, right? And that's 50% of your customer base leaving, which was the worst month. And so over that, it was probably, I actually can't remember. If you average it out, it was less than 4% a month, but we cut it down by like half over the course of the next year.
Okay.
But it was still like, ideally we were looking for net negative churn, right? Like where we
Right.
had actually had account growth. And so we made
Can
another
you share
decision.
can you share the concept of net negative churn for those that may not know
Yeah.
and why it
So
matters so much?
it's a good indication to investors that you have product market fit. Someone buys and there are more people that are paying you more, right? They're upgrading features, user like license seats, whatever it is, than there are people leaving you. And so you take the net of net negative sounds bad. It took me a while to wrap my
Right.
head around why. But so like there you have more customers expanding than you do contracting or leaving. And it's indicative of a healthy business, right? That you're actually getting more money from your existing customers while you're bringing on new ones at a higher rate than you are losing
them.
or contracting customers.
Yeah. So those numbers started to look great looking as you're swimming upstream selling larger logos. So, how did you think about fundraising at the time? So it seems like by the time you actually started this path of hiring, you did have some cash in the bank. You raised some institutional funding, a couple $1 million. And, how are you thinking about burn? And when was the next time you were going to raise? And like, what was that like?
I think a rule of thumb is probably if if your capital lasts you more than 18 to 24 months, you raise too much.
Huh.
In a normal cycle where you're like
Yeah.
growing consistently and things are moving in the right direction. And I say you raised too much, meaning you took more dilution than you needed to.
Correct.
So I think the expectation was that we wouldn't have raised capital again for 24 months or so. I underestimated how long it was going to take for salespeople to ramp. Right. So when we closed the seed round, $2 million, we invested heavily in sales and marketing and CS to handle all the growth that was going to come our way. And that increased burn, obviously, but combined with there was an accounting error. This predates the CFO.
Sure.
He's the one that found it, where we had been erroneously recognizing, misclassifying accidentally subscription or one-time implementation revenue for subscription revenue. So our cash flow projections, we thought they were much more than they were.
Right.
So we found ourselves hitting a spot far sooner than we planned where we needed more capital. And that kind of like, that's when the riff with the co-founder happened. And like it was hard. It was ugly. It was bad. So we ended up raising extension. Again, Kickstart was like, frankly, they had all the leverage in the world to like get whatever deal they wanted because we to make payroll.
Yeah.
And I went back and they put a deal forth and I went back to them and I was like, hey, I need for this to look clean. Like when we do go raise capital,
it can't hurt us.
They're going to see everything. Just do an extension, like structure. And they did it. Like they didn't have to, right? They so founder friendly. Like they were like, okay, yeah. So that $2 million seed round, I think, turned into a $10 million seed round over the course of the next. There were multiple extensions that we did. Because we trying to figure it out, trying to get where we need to go, trying to.
It's not actually that common. There's a lot of firms will just say, good luck, spend it right. And especially that many times. That's really great.
We had other, like there was a family office here in Phoenix that were meaningful investors. There was, we had a couple of, I don't know if we call them super angels, but like higher net worth individuals that, but I was raising capital constantly from basically middle of 2016 to the end of 2019. And then
later. Yeah. Or later, right? Your last round was in 2021, right?
Things started going so well. They're like, we should raise capital now. Like
right.
We're in 2020, we grew 1,000%, right? Like we 5 times the business. And so like we took advantage of some awesome growth.
So eVisit took an interesting growth path. It was like, really steady, figuring things out, figuring out product market fit, but not crazy growth for a while. And then you guys went into just a few years ago and exploded.
Yeah. And you talk about the rocket ship, like
right.
When the pandemic hit in 2020, March, it was a few days before my wife's birthday.
Right.
It went from like you work a lot as in a startup,
right?
50, 60-hour weeks, 100-hour weeks. I'm not exaggerating, like 100-hour weeks from mid-March through the end of June. And I was like, and let's raise money. Like, let's do it. Like, why not? Let's raise money.
It takes a lot of time.
Yeah, it was.
Well, you're going to look back, and I'm sure you already do, and be very grateful for that. Tell us, just in closing, tell us a little bit about what things look like for you today at the company, and any changes that you've had.
Yeah, so I was CEO from founding until January of this year, and it was about a year ago. I had brought on a president, a guy named Sachin Agrawal, awesome operator. Like he's phenomenal. And I think it was 3 to 6 months in, I was watching him operate, and I was like, I looked at it and I was like, I have 3 questions for myself. I'll put it this way. I was like, 1, can I do this? Can I take us from where we're at to where we need to go? And I was like, yeah, I think I can. Like being the CEO of a startup requires you got to iterate on yourself over and over again, because the guy or the girl who did the work from 0 to 1 million doesn't have the same skill set as the person who needs to be there from 1 to 10 and then from 10 to 100.
Right.
And so I was like, yeah, I think I can do it. And the second question was, do I want to do it? And my answer was, yeah, I've always wanted to be the guy to start it and exit it. And then the third question I asked myself was, can I do it as fast as Sachin can?
Mm.
And that's where I looked at it and I was like, I don't know. Right. Like, it wasn't like, no, I can't, but it was like, I don't know. And so I approached Sachin first and I was like, hey, I think you should be CEO of this business. And he was like, no, you're the founder. You're like, this is a partnership. If you're not here, it doesn't make sense. I'm like, okay. I waited a few more weeks after like we had a retreat. I went back to him. I was like, hey, I think you really should be, like, I'm watching this. Let me ask you a different way. Do you think you can get us where we need to go faster if you were in my chair? He's like, let me think about it. So I think he took a week. He came back to me and he's like, yeah, I think so. So I worked with Goldman, introduced us to a gentleman who we ended up bringing on as a board observer, amazing guy, John Connolly. He advises like Sixth Street, and he was a partner at Bain for a while, and he's, an advisor with Goldman. So he had come close to the business advisor, and I approached him and I was like, hey, I'm thinking about, I don't want to leave the business. I don't want to not be involved, but I also don't want to stand in the way of us getting where we need to go as fast as we can. So I approached him and he helped me define the role of chairman versus CEO. And then I worked with the board October, November-ish to start to warm them up to the idea. And frankly, like, as I look back, like, a lot of the joy, like, I love building things. I love creating things. I love being in situations where I can see the impact that I'm having. And it had gotten to the point where eVisit had become, as CEO, had become a lot more about sitting down every week and asking, like, did you do your job this week? Great. Right. Are you going to do your job next week? And awesome. Keep it up. Right. And then there was the strategy stuff, but I found the things that I loved was like interacting with customers and the sales process. And like, we had gone beyond where anyone was
startup stuff
get involved with like product.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so it was actually like, I was surprised. I expected to feel a lot more emotion about it than I did. There are certain things that hit me at different times, but never once have I been like, I shouldn't have stepped out of the seat. Like, Sachin is doing such an incredible job, and
right,
and great partner. Like, it's been a really good, and I think that's rare. I've never done it except for this one time, but I've heard from a lot of people that's not common, that a successor, there's a lot more butting of heads than is normal.
Well, we're happy for you, and really, thanks for taking the time to share your story today. It's pretty amazing what you can accomplish over, really like 10-year period, and playing the long game like you have.
Far longer than I think anyone wanted.
Yeah, for sure. But you guys did awesome, and thanks for taking the time to be with us on the show today. No Instructions, where there's not just one way to do anything. Thanks.
Thanks, Chad. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of No Instructions. Feel free to leave us a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts, and subscribe so we can continue producing these podcasts. Today's episode was brought to you by Distro. Distro is a platform to help startups find, hire, and pay employees in over 200 countries. It's free to use. Go to distro.io to set up your free account today.